edit out this transition period.
Okay. And while we're waiting, so I'm just going to start out with a little bit of just a preamble here. I don't have anything written out, so this is highly less formal than the wonderful lecture we just heard. And I'm assuming that the folks who are still online, that Melissa's sort of bringing into the panelist room, that you all are facilitators, even if you aren't facilitators, if you're just hanging on because you're curious about what's going on here. This isn't something that we're trying new for the first time this year, is giving people all of the discussion groups, which are a required component for UW side BRI participants to participate in three discussion groups each summer, linked to 3 lecture topics. And this year they're linked to I think the first 3 lectures, right, Melissa? Those discussions are always led by postdoctoral or faculty volunteers. Postdoctoral, we also have students in our MA program in bioethics who help us. So we have a number of people coming from different places in health sciences who volunteer to help us guide these 1-hour facilitated discussions on select topics. Most people who do this work for us don't have any formal training in doing it. They can get a little bit of advice and some materials from the BRI program, but we really don't do a lot else to kind of situate people and to give them thoughts and ideas about how to start a facilitated 1-hour discussion around some of these core research integrity issues. So I am joined today by my colleague, Dr. Tim Brown, who's assistant professor also in the Department of Bioethics and Humanities. And Tim and I want to just kind of lead a discussion amongst the, I don't know how many we got here, kind of 16 or 20 of us total who are online to kind of riff on some ideas. The other thing that we wanted to share with you, and I think, Melissa, would you mind putting a link to that OneDrive page? I don't know, I think this has already been sent out to people, but we also want to provide just a kind of a shared web page. We had originally thought about maybe doing this as a Canvas web, discussion board, but that turned out to be kind of logistically too complicated. But as a place so Melissa just put that into the chat, a place where you can go and put thoughts or comments or notes, either based on the readings that are suggested readings for the discussion groups, or things that are coming out for you as a result of this lecture. Ideas where you can share ideas with your fellow facilitators, and places where facilitators, as you're preparing to lead a discussion group, can go. I'm talking too much. Tim, would you like to say anything, or would you like to lead us off in thinking about what are the kind of, for you, the primary take homes from Dr. Severson's lecture this afternoon?
Excellent. Well, thank you, Malia, for getting us started and giving us that very helpful preamble to situate us. I thought that we could talk about the lecture in underneath 3 questions. So I thought we could think about what the greater takeaways from the lecture were. We could think about, since we're all either having conversations about research integrity or research misconduct in laboratories in specific contexts, we could talk about, if all of you are willing to share, previous conversations we've had about research misconduct and how we've handled those in the past. And then once we've established what the takeaways are and what conversations we've had before, what kinds of conversations do we anticipate having, or do you anticipate having in these discussion groups? So to start off with some of the main takeaways, I thought Julie's presentation was extremely interesting, and one of the bigger takeaways that I noticed was the possibility of detrimental research practices turning into research misconduct downstream. So all of the things that a person might think of as research misconduct simpliciter, things like misrepresenting yourself in academic papers as having certain kinds of credentialing when you do not, um, or certain failures of mentorship, for example, things that seem like they are research misconduct. They are just practices that lead to research misconduct, and it sort of tracks my previous experiences of these detrimental research practices, because a lack of mentorship, for example, can lead a postdoc or a graduate student to become desperate when they just want to finish their degree or just want to get the paper out to the conference. And they may make compromises that constitute research misconduct and could trigger a kind of investigation. Another takeaway that I found was that this idea that you should come up with your own personal RCR or research integrity plan or set of best practices, because everyone is in their own context, right? Everyone's lab is different. Some people work with human subjects, some people work with animal subjects, some people work with no subjects at all. They work in a dry lab. And so what potential failures of research that are possible in your lab are going to be different, and your values, your lab's culture, your own training, your own resources at your own institution or the subgroup that you're associated with, or even the way that research misconduct is handled by your funders. Every aspect of this matters, and so it takes a lot of reflective practice to figure out what your values are, what everyone else's values are, what resources are available, and then situate yourself in that context. So I thought those were really interesting takeaways.
Yeah.
How about for you, Malia?
Yeah, no, thank you so much, Tim. I totally agree. This kind of, it's sort of along the lines of this sort of this idea that we have in ethics or in philosophy of the so-called slippery slope, right? Is that these what I have a different acronym in my head. Is it's not questionable research practices. It's what was her word for it? It was I have it here.
I was thinking detrimental.
Detrimental, thank you. The detrimental research practices. I mean, I think this move from detrimental to kind of frank research misconduct. I mean, I think it's so important to be thinking about that, particularly with junior investigators and trainees, because you hear these egregious cases, right? I mean, you hear about people who are like wildly fabricating their data and lying in multiple grant applications and doing this amazing image manipulation like she was showing us. And, I think most reasonable people, myself included, you sit there and you listen to this and you go, I would never do this. I would never do this. Right. And so, but helping trainees to think about what broader, in terms of some of those systemic pressures, what kind of broader things going on in the research environment might lead them to some of these, more detrimental practices that, if not overtly rising to the level of something that would, trigger an ORI investigation, would still nevertheless cause harm, right? And then I think this other point that you're making, Tim, about what would constitute a detrimental or harmful practice is going to look different in different research contexts. Now, one of the interesting challenges of the facilitated discussions is we bring trainees into these discussions. They self-schedule themselves. And so we are not doing these in kind of siloed ways. So you're not getting a bunch of biochemists sitting in the room together. You're having people who are coming from different kinds of research backgrounds and training. But I think then it becomes an opportunity to explore the ways in which slightly different research environments, different values, and different priorities might make that question of what would constitute a detrimental practice. I think it would be useful to trainees to be thinking about what might be detrimental in one setting might not necessarily be detrimental in another setting. So I think that those are really great points. I think another take home for me that comes out and that I can't emphasize enough, and I think would be an excellent place to begin some of these conversations, is near the end of her presentation, Julie talked about communicate, communicate, communicate. And I think, although she did not cite these data, I'm aware of data which suggests that the slippery slope begins, the detrimental research practices start typically when investigators are feeling crunched and also are isolated, that they're working late at night alone, they're feeling that pressure, but coming together in community with one's lab mates, exploring alternative ways of approaching problems, and reaching out to lab members with curiosity and with good intention, rather than starting with necessarily an accusation of misconduct, might be a better way to go. So anyway, so those are some of the thoughts that I have. I'm curious, for those of you who are on the line, if anybody is willing to come on screen, other people have kind of big takeaways that they took away from the talk, or things that really struck them that they might think would be a good way to begin a facilitated discussion around this topic of research misconduct. Okay, people are not necessarily willing to jump in. That's all right. That's okay. This is our maiden voyage with this.
It is.
Well, I mean, so there are some ideas that Tim and I have thrown out. So Tim, if you were leading a facilitated discussion, would you, well, let's maybe coming to this next idea that you talked about, which is like ways in which you would talk about how you've had discussions about this issue in the past with people that you work with or who might share interests in this area with you.
Absolutely. So this is probably why I'm so interested in this move from detrimental research practice to research misconduct, because those are the contexts that I've been brought into conversations in my own lab when I was a graduate student, and in other people's labs when I was just a bioethics trainee floating from lab to lab. And so, yeah, these I noticed that Julie answered the question, what are the biggest issues or the most common issues that come to her office? And it's these authorship disputes, right? I've seen a fair number of those where someone feels as though they have been, robbed of some kind of credit, and all of a sudden now they have to rethink their research projects in terms of producing those papers that are required. And some programs require 3 papers, but if another graduate student poaches them and they end up as third author, it's hard to use that as part of your graduation requirements, your defense requirements. And so some of that competitiveness can turn into research misconduct. But most common in my sphere has always been failures of mentorship. It's always been a failure. Usually it's been a failure of mentorship. The student feels like they don't know what kind of what trajectory their research project should take. They don't know who to reach out to, or if it's okay to even reach out to someone else, or that they can even reach out to someone else to be part of their committee. or be part of their research projects. And that the desperation and the lack of sometimes mental health care resources can lead people to do certain kinds of things. And so those have been the conversations, but I haven't had conversations as a lab about these sorts of things. At least when I was a trainee, the conversations I had were more as a co-conspirator to other trainees, and someone who will try to help fill in the gaps that a mentor left open. And this has happened a lot where graduate students or postdocs will get together and do that work of making sure that these failures don't result in research misconduct. People looking at it, at figures and making sure that they don't make those research conduct style mistakes, making sure that data is collected properly, so on and so forth. And so I would be really interested to hear if any of you have had those kinds of experiences, like in your previous lives in laboratories or your current lives in laboratories. Bless you.
Yeah. I mean, I know certainly for myself, I've had those I've had those conversations, I've had those sets of concerns. I think that things are even, because I'm old now, I think things are so hyper competitive now that, you know, that this, particularly when you're part of a very large collaborative team, that pressure on, you know, a graduate student to do the whatever is required to get that first authored publication. I mean, I do think that those pressures are very, very real. And I do think that having the conversation in a lab setting, I think that one of the things that trainees often struggle with is, and I would love your thoughts on this, Tim, is, you know, like who do I speak to first? I mean, let's say I have a concern. I feel like let's do this kind of an example. A graduate student, maybe just a first or second year graduate student, with someone who's fairly conscientious, maybe has attended BRI, observes what they believe to be an instance of image manipulation in a peers in progress publication. It's not yet gone out into the world, but let's say it's a postdoc in the lab. Let's say it's not just the postdoc. Let's say it's like the favorite postdoc. It's the one that the mentor loves, right? I mean, how does one start to begin to explore that concern? It sounds like in your experience, talking to fellow students might have been the way to begin. That may or may not always be the right thing to do. And again, I think it will be very situational and very context dependent. But I mean, do you have any thoughts on that, of how to manage hierarchical concerns in the research setting as one's trying to try out concerns or get advice from research peers?
Absolutely. This is a great question because, yeah, like you said, consulting your peers may not be the right move, especially if your peers are hyper competitive. And if you care for example, the 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 favorite in your lab, if you really do care for them, if they're your favorite too, and you don't hold any bad feelings toward them and you want the best for them, you may want to find a amicable solution, a way of correcting this person before they run into serious research misconduct. Because it may not be image falsification. It may just be an honest mistake that turned into image falsification. This happened to me in a laboratory once, without naming names. A lab mate from another laboratory accidentally used an old image and labeled it with the new results. And that could have been seen as image manipulation, but the other graduate students in their lab and in my lab, in one of their mock presentations, caught it in time and said, hey, you need to do this. But if your colleagues, if your peers are not that supportive, how do you seek out help? And honestly, I don't want to use a military metaphor or structure, but I think it is important to observe the chain of command. I think it is important to not necessarily go over the head of the person that you're trying to intervene on, right? So going to the PI in your lab might not be the best move if, again, you do care for the person. Sometimes it does make sense to go to an adjacent lab, ask them what they think. But I think that assuaging worries about, am I just bringing up a false accusation? I think those are important early on. So just getting confirmation from supportive peers, but also supportive and neutral superiors of your own, right? So if you have a PI that you trust to keep a secret, I've done that in the past. I know lots of trainees who've done that in the past. I've served in that role for others. I think that can be really helpful. Take it to them and see, is this image manipulation? Is this falsification? Is this research misconduct? And then once you've established that, maybe in the right context, you can reach out to that person directly. There was a student who was presenting some research as his own by accident, as just a nice idea to present to a number of people, without failing to do, without disclosing that the idea was another student's, one of their trainees. And after consulting with people, I just went to that person and told them, or I asked them, so are you going to publish this with this student? And they got very nervous and went, oh yeah, I'm going to. And now that's what they're going to do. So there are lots of small tactics. I really do think that it helps to have these kinds of conversations in advance, though, to figure out what kinds of tactics are even possible, because you can just get paralyzed thinking about stigmatizing your colleagues, or becoming taking on the brunt of stigma yourself.
Yeah, no, but I do think that's interesting, of the ways in which to kind of use peers or colleagues in kind of adjacent laboratories. We do, I don't know, and we're recording this, so we're going to make this available to facilitators. We do, within the UW School of Medicine, have a allies program, which is for graduate students and trainees who might be encountering various difficulties that rise to the level of, these kinds of questionable or, possibly detrimental research practices, or other kinds of sometimes relationship difficulties in a laboratory setting, and they need a kind of a neutral third party but faculty level support. And you can go to the UW, you can Google UW Allies, you can make a formal request, and you will be put in touch with whoever the intake person is that week. And it's another place where people can go, which is definitely like definitely a level down from contacting the ombudsperson or going to Julie Severson's office, for example, a way in which to air confidentially concerns and get, third-party advice. So I just want to put that out there for people as an additional resource. And maybe we can go and put that on the OneDrive page for facilitators, so that they have that for future reference. I'm curious, for those of you who are hanging on, I know everybody's being really quiet, even if you don't want to unblind yourself from the black box, if there are other questions or comments, things you want to put into the chat or into the Q&A, things that you might like Tim and I to address in our last 2 minutes here, as additional kind of thought bubbles or ideas or suggestions for you as you move forward with facilitating various discussion groups. Okay. So Dong-Hyu is asking about if we have records of prior discussions from previous years. I don't think we have recordings of facilitated discussions from prior years. We do have a kind of suggested format. And if you're brand new to this and you're concerned about kind of leading one of these cold, you definitely have the option, and you can interact with Melissa around this, of taking, if you're willing to take the time to sit in on a more experienced colleague to watch them facilitate a group and just to sort of be there as a kind of a fly on the wall observer. That's what we would recommend. But generally, for a bunch of reasons, and including the fact that we're typically handling multiple of these discussions at the same time, we generally, and we're also trying to preserve confidentiality of information shared, we do not record these conversations, unfortunately. Well, that's a great question.
Excellent question. Yes.
Yeah. Well, I think we only allotted 30 minutes for this. Tim, last thoughts or, you know, final words of wisdom from you before we sign off today?
I think one of the things that I enjoy about leading conversations about ethics is how earnest and personal and conversational things can get. It's not just about regurgitating facts from a lecture. It's about, you know, putting the facts that you learned in lecture into practice. And so if at all possible, try to make room for your discussants to share their personal experiences whenever they feel comfortable. I participated in a number of discussions last year. I guess all of them. I participated in 3 of them as a new hire in the bioethics and humanities department. I just wanted to see what was going on. And those were the conversations that I enjoyed the most, is when everybody felt comfortable asking a question about peer review, for example, right? Like, oh, like how can I juggle the responsibilities of both publishing and doing peer review, and how can I get that kind of experience? And we actually strategized about those kinds of things. So in this conversation coming up, making that space, being as open as possible to people's stories and narratives, and being respectful of those narratives is going to make all the difference. And so, especially with a delicate subject like this one. So I appreciate all of you being here. It demonstrates a commitment to leading a fruitful ethics conversation. And I know it will go well for all of you.
Yeah. All right. Thank you so much, Tim. And yes, I just, again, to express my thanks and gratitude to all of you for hanging on. I hope that at least this little bit of back and forthing between myself and Tim have been helpful in terms of generating some ideas. Please go and check out that OneDrive site, put some questions or comments there. We would love, because this is a new innovation for us, which may or may not be helpful. We would love even informal feedback on whether you found this little bit of ping-ponging back and forth and reflecting on the lecture helpful for you as you're preparing for your facilitation. But yes, I think that giving a way in for your discussants to begin to grapple with some of these concerns, which I think are just bread and butter in some ways, about kind of professionalism and research practice, I think it will be very, very welcome. So thank you again. Oh, great. And Melissa, thanks for putting that link in one more time. All right. Thank you all for your time. We really appreciate you. And thank you for your service and contribution to the BRI program. Good night.
Thank you so much.
Thanks.
Good night.